My grandfather was an awful person. I know that's probably not the most kosher thing to say about a close family member, but I think most people who knew him, including him, would agree. He was a stone-faced man, never showed much emotion, and always had a fuse about as short as the balding gray hair atop his scalp. He wore a seemingly perpetual scowl upon his face, and a narrowed brow that seemed to sneer with that "get the heck off my lawn" energy that only a proud boomer could properly muster. I remember one summer my family went out to visit him and my grandma, only for him to chastise my older sister for gaining a little bit of weight. It of course made her cry and quickly devolved into a huge family drama that may never have been fully resolved. In stark contrast, my grandma was the most loving and kind person that I had ever known. So when she passed away a few years ago, it really struck my whole family hard. The funeral was a sordid affair, with my grandfather remaining distant the entire time and not bothering to say a word on her behalf. The rest of the family gave eulogies and tried commemorating her the best that we could, but Grandpa seemed not to notice or care either way. Once the ceremony concluded, most of the guests dispersed from the church. As the attendees thinned, I found myself alone in the pews. Grandpa was seated up at the front, and although I didn't necessarily want to talk with him, I felt as though I should. "Grandpa, I'm really sorry for your loss." He turned to me, a look of spite etched upon his face. He seemed to take note of my expression, and his faltered into a sigh. "Thanks, buddy. A tough day for all of us." He dabbed his forehead with a handkerchief and swallowed hard. In that moment, I saw my grandfather in a way that I never had before. He was broken and vulnerable, newly alone in the world and clearly struggling to come to terms with it. I felt for him, and although we had never had the best relationship, I very much wanted to try and be there for him. Grandpa rose from his seat and approached the casket. He put a hand down upon it, speaking softly under his breath. "Oh, don't worry, darling. I'm right behind you." Grandpa and I talked a bit more, and eventually I decided that he could use some company for the night. Although he was off-putting as a person, he was still family. And there was also something that I always found interesting about him. There was something about him that always enthralled me. Despite his cold exterior, I knew there was more to him than just mean for mean's sake. Either way, no one should have to mourn alone, and so I decided to join him for dinner. After the ceremony concluded, I left the church and went to the store and picked up some fresh steaks, golden potatoes, and asparagus. I figured cooking him a good meal was the least I could do considering the difficult circumstances. My grandparents' old home was considerably more worn and overgrown than last I had seen it as I pulled my car into the driveway. Of course, it was understandable considering the situation, but the difference was stark. It had been well over a decade since the last time I had been out there, and although vaguely familiar, the wear and tear made it seem foreign. Grandpa welcomed me at the door, and the two of us went into the backyard as he fired up the grill. It was a bit awkward at first, but after a beer or two, we started opening up a little more to one another. I told him about my life, my fiancé, work, and he seemed genuinely interested in it. We talked a while as the steaks grilled, but I realized not many are reading this to hear about my fated reunion with my estranged grandfather. This is a place for horror stories after all, and as such, it's probably best to just cut to the chase. Grandpa worked in prison rehabilitation for the entirety of his career. He began at just 18 years old as a prison guard, and eventually worked his way up to warden, which he presided as up until his retirement several years ago. I asked him which prison he worked for, but he sort of avoided the question. Boy, that's gotta be a tough line of work, huh? I floated the question out, and he paused to ponder it. He switched the beer in his bottle before shrugging. Nah, you get used to it, like anything, I suppose. But it'd be a lie to call it easy. Always gotta be on your toes, anticipating things to pop off at any moment. Never know what to expect, really. He told me a few stories that he had from his long tenure of corrections. He almost seemed overly eager to talk about them, and it made me realize that he probably didn't have anybody else to tell them to. He was a bit of a loner after all, and it made me feel for him that his wife and likely only real human connection in the world was now gone. The two of us ate our dinner and continued chatting about his work in the prison industry and the plethora of experiences that he was subjected to there. He had plenty of lighthearted stuff about coworkers and various interactions with inmates, but his tone seemed hampered. I don't know how to explain it, but it was likely there was something else that bothered him, and I decided to try and coax it out of him. You probably saw some messed up things there too, huh? Grandpa sat back and thought, his pale white beard partially obscuring his disconcerted grimace. He then chuckled and put his hands together on his lap. Yeah, you could say that. As I had hoped, he then delved into a few stories about stabbings, attempted breakouts, and attacks on prison personnel. He had no shortage of rather gruesome events to recall, but of course, there was one which had dwarfed them all. Then there were the experiments. My interest peaked as soon as he had said that. He paused then, his head slowly swiveling on his shoulders. Experiments? Yeah, or clinical trials, I suppose. They can sugarcoat them however they like, but that don't change the reality of it. Far as I know, they never even published the findings, and I'm not surprised. He was clearly a bit reluctant to divulge the details, and I didn't want to push him on it. The admission alone seemed to hang like a weight on his neck, dragging his posture down and his eyes into fog. If there is a God out there, I can understand why we never hear from him. And Grandpa said that he had been working at the prison for a good 2 decades when these experiments began. By then, he was the lead guard on shift, and essentially second in command to the presiding warden at the time. Grandpa was summoned by the warden one day for an impromptu meeting, or so he thought. As he entered the room, he found the warden with 2 other men in his office. The 2 men were well-dressed in blue suede suits with polished black wingtips. Both had neatly combed hair and beards with stark blue eyes. The warden introduced them to Grandpa as Mr. Smith and Mr. Johnson, but did not elaborate who they were or what organization they worked for. No doubt it was some government branch, but I never got confirmation either way, Grandpa explained. Apparently, the 2 men had already struck up a deal with the warden, and Grandpa was to be a part of it as well. They explained they were conducting an experiment to test the limits of the human psyche. They explained that all Grandpa would have to do was the same thing that he had been doing for 20 years. Guard the cells and ensure there were no complications with the inmates. The deal came with a substantial financial bonus, one which nearly doubled Grandpa's salary that year. But of course, he knew there would be a catch. The things we do for money. He just shook his head solemnly as he said it. These experiments would go on to be known unofficially as the Seclusion Project. The idea was a simple one. Take 5 prisoners and put them into solitary confinement indefinitely. Smith and Johnson's crew would monitor them and conduct research as they saw fit. The 2 men explained it was important research to determine the harmful effects on the human psyche to further understanding of the brain, but Grandpa saw through it. It was cruel. It was inhumane, and by the end of it, it was a crime against humanity. They knew that from the beginning, but they also knew that no one would speak on the behalf of those they chose. 5 inmates were chosen for the experiment. The warden claimed they had volunteered for a reduced sentence, but Grandpa knew that that was a lie. To put it simply, the 5 chosen were among the worst offenders currently imprisoned. Prisoner 1 was a middle-aged white man who had been convicted of multiple counts of aggravated assault against minors. He had been sentenced to 57 years and had served just 4 up to that point. Prisoner 2 was an elderly white male who had been convicted of the murder and attack of 6 different female workers over the span of 9 years. He had been given 3 life sentences and was the longest currently incarcerated inmate in the entire prison. Prisoner 3 was a black male responsible for the stabbing of an elderly couple and their 7-year-old grandson as a result of a home invasion. He had been sentenced to capital punishment and had been on death row for almost 5 years awaiting his fate. Prisoner 4 was a middle-aged Hispanic male who had once served as a hitman for a notorious drug gang. He had been convicted of executing 8 people and disposing of their remains during his tenure, though many believe his body count was much higher. Prisoner 5 was actually the only inmate that wasn't currently incarcerated at my grandpa's prison. He was brought in from another prison, but Grandpa was never able to get a hold of his file to see where he was transferred from and what he was currently in for. He described the guy as a young, very skinny, white male with long black hair and evil eyes. Grandpa said he locked eyes with the guy once and only once, viscerally rattled by the experience. The cells in which the participants were to be housed were in an isolated wing of the prison deep underground. Each cell had been retrofitted with a number of augmentations which were completed by Smith and Johnson's crew. It took them almost a full year to complete it. But once they were done, the cells were unlike any others. Entirely soundproof from the inside, and entirely devoid of light. Cameras equipped with both infrared and night vision lenses were installed upon the ceiling of each cell to monitor the occupants 24/7. Finally, the renovations were completed and the cells were ready to fulfill their grim purpose. One by one, Grandpa and his team escorted the men into each of the cells. Most went quietly without a word spoken. Grandpa theorized that the men were given promises of commuting their sentences, which helped ensure their compliance, but this was never confirmed. Inmate 3 talked non-stop throughout the trek to the cell, asking all manner of questions about a variety of things. Grandpa and his men just remained silent. Inmate 5 was mostly silent during the transport as well, his long dark hair covering his face the entire way. At several points, Grandpa swore that he heard the guy giggle under his breath. He said that it sounded like a kid's laugh, and that obviously didn't make him feel any better. The guy went into his cell without protest, and as his door shut, the trials had officially begun. All the lights in the block were extinguished, and the outer soundproof doors were shut. Each cell was separated far from one another to prevent the inmates from being able to communicate verbally. From there, all the supervising team had to do was wait and watch. Grandpa simply went back to his duties then. checking in periodically on Smith and Johnson's team, but never venturing into the cell block. The inmates were to have no contact with the outside world whatsoever, and no exposure to light of any kind. Small slots in the walls were used to distribute food and water, and the inmates were well fed with good hearty meals unlike the majority of the other inmates in the prison. Grandpa continually emphasized how uncomfortable he was with the whole thing, even from the get-go. "Why didn't you say anything?" I bit my tongue as the words left my lips, worried that I would offend him. Grandpa just sighed, his shoulders slumped as his lips pursed. "It's hard to speak on behalf of those that you detest, even if you know they're being wronged." There was a profound truth to his words, and it made me take pause as he added another thought. It's not an acceptable excuse, but... He just trailed off there, shaking his head and sighing. After just a few days of seclusion, the inmates were already struggling quite a lot. Inmate 2 had been crying periodically, while 3 showed signs of severe paranoia. The other 3 remained mostly silent. 5 was the most unnerving, however, sitting almost entirely motionless for the entire day aside from sleeping. 4 tried to keep himself busy doing push-ups and sit-ups, while 1 mostly just laid around in various positions, slipping in and out of consciousness. On the eve of day 5, Inmate 2 had slammed his head into the side of the cell and began bleeding from his nose and mouth. After the impact, he fell and convulsed for several seconds on the ground as blood dripped from him. He fell still, and my grandpa anticipated them conducting a medical intervention, but they never did. They just continued to monitor as Inmate 2 was left to his own devices. Later that same day, Inmate 3 suddenly screamed. He began scrambling around his cell blind, slamming into walls and babbling incoherently. "There's something in here, man. Let me out." He shouted the words as tears poured from his eyes. He continued freaking out for a few more minutes until tiring himself out. He then collapsed onto the ground, panting heavily, staring upward to the top of the cell. He couldn't have seen it, but my grandpa swears that he was staring directly into the feed of the camera. Inmate 1 began having conversations with himself, apparently acting as both parties on either side of the conversation. The things he discussed with himself began as asinine, even comical at times, but they quickly took a disturbing turn. He role-played conversations between a young boy and his father, and the things discussed turned Grandpa's stomach. He wouldn't repeat or even hint at them, but considering why Inmate 1 was imprisoned in the first place, I can probably fill in the blanks. Inmate 1 then broke down, sobbing quietly as he held himself in the fetal position. My grandpa says this was the moment that really made him actually feel something for the inmates and question what he had signed up for. "These men did horrible things, there ain't no change in that. But even so, you come to realize how everyone has a story. Were they born monsters or were they made monsters? I won't pretend to understand how these things work, but what I do understand, from one human being to another, is the suffering of life." Things only got worse from there, and outbursts of screaming and sobbing became commonplace among all participants, minus Inmate 5. Alone in the silent darkness, they had nothing but their own minds to keep them company, and that company was clearly not bringing much comfort. Inmate 4 would often pantomime holding a gun and seemingly acting out shootouts and conflicts in his cell. His breathing would increase and he'd be moving and ducking around the cell as though he were trying to avoid getting shot. Inmate 3 would shuffle around his cell, flinching randomly and at times collapsing to the ground as though somebody had struck him. Inmate 2's condition had continued to deteriorate. Clearly, his head wound trauma had likely caused a brain trauma, and he would often suffer seizures and fits of screaming at the top of his lungs. He refused to eat, and the food that he was given began to pile up by the cell door. Some of the prison personnel wanted to retrieve him for medical assistance, but Smith and Johnson wouldn't allow it. They were told time and time again that no matter what happens to the inmates, they were not to intervene. By day 9, inmate 2 was dead. He had been laying motionless face down for nearly a full day when his passing was finally confirmed. As they rewound the footage to try and determine the time of death, they noticed something odd. As soon as inmate 2's chest had stopped moving, inmate 1 suddenly perked up. He then lifted his head and smiled, extending his hand to wave at something as though he were saying goodbye to an old friend. He, of course, had no way of communicating with inmate 2, nor knowing that he had passed. It was a weird event, but it was regarded as a simple coincidence. Inmate 1 continued to deteriorate after that, spending most of his time just sitting catatonic in his cell. Inmates 3 and 4 also confirmed to show signs of severe delusions and paranoia. Inmate 4 would randomly burst into fits of screaming, as though he were threatening a rival before reverting to hysteric sobbing as he begged to be let out of his cell. At one point, he punched the wall full force, shattering his fist into a mangled mess of flesh and bone. Contrary to the rest, inmate 5 hardly ever made a peep. He would sit motionless in his cell for hours, hiding his face as he seemed to meditate. Every once in a while, he would look directly into the camera lens though, despite not being able to see it. My grandpa said that he still gets chills picturing the way the guy smiled, and swears something about him was downright evil. "Let me ask you a question." Grandpa suddenly interrupted his tale. Behind the smoldering campfire, I spied him staring down at his boots, swirling his whiskey in his glass. His eyes then drifted to me, an almost hesitant aura in his eyes. Is it evil to do evil things to evil people? I thought about it for a moment, a cold chill slithering down my spine as I anticipated where this topic was headed. I wish I could say that I came up with some profound response, but I didn't, and I still don't have one. In the end, I just shrugged and took a swig of my lager. Grandpa's expression then shifted, as though he were at a similar stalemate himself. I fear the day the world finds an answer to that question. Eventually, the team conducting the trial brought medical supplies to inmate 4. As soon as the guard slid open the access port at the bottom of the door, inmate 4 lunged for it. "Let me out, please. You gotta let me out or do anything." He tried grabbing at the guard through the port, but the guard managed to retreat away. He then slammed his baton on the man's hands until he recoiled back inside. The guard flung the tray of food along with the medical supplies in after him and slid the port shut. Inmate 4 began to sob hysterically, switching between bargaining and yelling threats for nearly half an hour. He eventually seemed to wear himself out and collapsed in a heap in his cell, but not before muttering one final chilling phrase. "Please don't let it get me." Grandpa ended up working late that night, and just before he clocked out was when it had happened. One of the other guards frantically called him to the monitor station. On the feed, Grandpa saw inmate 4 flailing around desperately and screaming. He said it seemed like something was attacking him, but of course, there was nothing else in there. By this point, the two station guards had already witnessed so many disturbing events that they wanted to intervene and help the guy, but Grandpa overruled them. His chest seemed to deflate as he admitted that, but in the end, all the three of them did was watch. Inmate 4 continued to wrestle around for several long minutes until finally falling flat on his back. He then began to grasp for his neck and appeared as though he believed someone was straddling his chest and choking him. He began to gurgle and cough, flailing desperately as his eyes bulged from their sockets. In under a minute, he let out a soft gasp as the strength drained from his body, and he fell still, never to move again. Once again, the moment that Inmate 4 fell still, Inmate 1 perked up. Just as before, he then smiled and waved while staring in the direction of Inmate 4's cell, despite not knowing where he was housed or even that he was there to begin with. Inmate 5 then suddenly perked up from his fetal position, his neck craned backwards and head angled upwards, but his face seemed entirely devoid of emotion. "Please, don't let it get me." He repeated the final words of Inmate 4 in a whisper. He, like Inmate 1, had no way of knowing nor hearing Inmate 4, and yet somehow repeated the exact same phrase. As the words left his mouth, his lips curled into a wide, almost inhuman smile. Grandpa described it as the look worn only by the most deranged of lunatics. Inmate 5 then erupted into a bellowing laugh which caused everyone in the observatory room to flinch. Grandpa said that he was nearly scream laughing at the top of his lungs as his eyes seemed to bulge out of their sockets. After a good full minute, he finally seemed to quiet as his calamitous laugh quieted to a hushed giggle. "Please don't let it get me." He then turned and once again glared directly into the hidden camera lens in his cell. Grandpa described that moment as feeling like he was staring into the eyes of the devil himself. He had seen enough for that night, but before leaving, Smith caught up with Grandpa as he was about to head out. He first made casual conversation with him before asking him a series of strange questions. "You ever see anything weird around here? How are you sleeping lately? You guys get a lot of inspections in this facility." Grandpa didn't say much in response, just shrugging off most of the questions. Smith tried to code his inquiries in a nonchalant manner, but Grandpa knew better than that. There was no way of hiding the dread which dripped from his every word, for Grandpa felt it too. The following morning, Grandpa got a call as he was preparing himself for his shift. The call was from a frantic coworker telling him they needed him there ASAP, but didn't clarify what had happened. Grandpa arrived at the prison not long after, and was quickly ushered into the camera room. There he noticed that Inmate 5's cell was suddenly empty. Grandpa asked where Inmate 5 was, and the solemn guards had just guided his attention to the monitors. They played the recording from the previous night at just before 3 a.m. Grandpa watched mystified as 1 second, Inmate 5 was seen sitting idle before suddenly just vanishing. There was no split in the feed, no movement of any kind. Just 1 second he was there and the next he was gone. Grandpa stared at the other 2 guards, but neither of them had any explanation for what had just happened. One of them suggested going into the cell to check it out firsthand, but none of them were eager to do that. Instead, they waited around spitballing theories until Johnson and Smith arrived along with the warden. Grandpa then informed them what had happened and showed them the video from Inmate 5's cell the previous night. Grandpa said that was the first and only time he ever saw any emotion on their faces, and their reaction clearly conveyed their fear. "Lock the prison down now. No one comes in or goes out," Johnson commanded, and the befuddled warden sounded the alarm. Every single prisoner in the entire complex was returned to their cells. Grandpa and the other guards spent the next 12 hours combing every square inch of the prison. Despite their best efforts, not a single trace of inmate 5 was found. The search was eventually extended beyond the prison walls, but once again the attempt proved futile. Eventually, Smith and Johnson ventured in to search the seclusion cell block themselves. By this point, only inmates 1 and 3 were still alive in their cells. Neither of them reacted as the men entered the block. Inmate 1 continued just rocking back and forth, mumbling, while inmate 3 appeared to be asleep. Smith and Johnson were in there for nearly an hour before returning defeated and stupefied. They didn't say much to the others, and by that point, the entire staff was exhausted from the day's events. Grandpa and his crew were dismissed as the night crew took over. Grandpa said that he had some of the worst nightmares of his life that night, and barely slept a wink despite being exhausted. When he returned to work the following day, he found the other members of his crew looking much the same. They were all summoned into the meeting room with the warden as they awaited their instructions. The warden then informed them that the experiment had been discontinued. The only surviving members of inmate 1 and 3 were to be returned to general population. Grandpa protested that decision but was overruled. It turns out that Grandpa was right to be wary, as neither inmate lasted long when back in the prison. Inmate 3 began behaving like a cornered animal, showing signs of paranoia and aggression. He got in multiple fights with other inmates, until one scuffle ended with him getting his head slammed into a bed. He ended up dying from severe cranial hemorrhage not long after. Inmate 1 was much more composed, but not less traumatized. He just kept to himself, refusing to eat and isolating himself from everyone. After about a week of his self-imposed starvation, Grandpa's team prepared to intervene. They found him dead in his cell the following morning. His body was taken in for autopsy, but the coroner could not determine a cause of death. Apparently, the fallout from this event caused the former warden of the prison to step down. My grandfather was named the new warden shortly thereafter, but a lot of the other guards ended up leaving as well. For a while, the management was worried about a potential legal investigation, but as time went on, there was nothing. They never heard from Smith or Johnson again, and in time, people forgot altogether. But Grandpa never did. He polished off the remainder of his beer and clasped his hands before him as he concluded his story. The campfire had been reduced to smoldering coals by then, and Grandpa's once serious demeanor appeared suddenly much more crestfallen. "We all do things we're not proud of, you know. We all make decisions for what we think is the best option. But sometimes we're wrong. I did it for the money, there's no denying that. But why did they do it? Smith and Johnson, or whatever their real names were. Why did they do it?" His gray eyes drifted to me, as though he expected me to answer. More than likely, he searched for any answer that could be offered, but I hadn't one to give. "Did they ever find him? That prisoner that disappeared?" And Grandpa's head slowly swiveled side to side as his eyes seemed to deflate. "As far as I know, he was never seen again." It was in that moment that I almost found myself skeptical. He had told his story so well that I very nearly believed it. "You're messing with me," I called him on it, but his face didn't falter an inch. He slowly turned to me with that cold, ironclad stare that he was renowned for. He didn't need to say anything in his defense, for his expression told me that his words were true, and they had haunted him for a lifetime. How does that happen? How does somebody just vanish into thin air? And Grandpa shrugged at the question and massaged the back of his neck. He thought for a moment and then smirked, but refused to make eye contact. If you can figure that one out, you let me know. He chuckled to himself and then crossed his arms. There was one report years ago. This young gal was at home alone one night when someone tried to break into her house. Poor thing was scared stiff, and the description she gave of the man she had seen seemed to match inmate 5. He met my bewildered stare as I hung on every word. So the cops looked around, but they couldn't find anything. Things calmed down, and then about a month later, that same young lady vanishes. Never seen again, never solved. He paused once more and then scoffed as he adjusted his posture. 'Cause it's impossible, right? All of it is. That's what I would say if somebody told me, but yet I was there. I seen it. He fell silent once more as the two of us contemplated the prospect. I figured it best to allow him to convey his thoughts, and so I waited until he spoke again. Maybe it's best we don't know, but there was one detail of that troubling story which really spooked me. There was a message written in blood on the front of her house. He paused and glanced at me, as if waiting for me to conclude the thought. It struck me then, and a cold chill slithered down my spine. Please don't let it get me, I answered, and Grandpa nodded solemnly. The two of us just fell silent for a while, contemplating the disturbing story before he spoke again. There's a phrase I've heard before, maybe you have too. Hurt people hurt people. People that have been traumatized will traumatize others. Maybe that's what these things we call demons are. Trauma that takes on a life or an existence of its own. He paused and I contemplated his words once more. It was a frightening thought, but I haven't the faintest clue how these things work, so maybe he's right. It's the best explanation that I can think of, but what do I know? I've screwed up my own life enough that maybe I'm just trying not to hate myself. His eyes seemed to gloss over and his lips trembled. He seemed like he so desperately wished to pour his heart out and for once be vulnerable, but as always he didn't. Good talk, bud. Don't stay up too late. That was all I got. His last parting words before taking his leave. It was the last conversation that we ever had, but his words have been with me ever since. I don't know what to make of his story, but he sure seemed to put a lot of stock in it. It horrified me knowing what he was a part of, but I suppose I shouldn't be that surprised. I'm sure there's all sorts of nefarious experiments and trials in the past, but that's not really what this account was for. Grandpa was a complicated man who lived a complicated life. I never knew him well, but I'm glad that I got to know him a little bit. It makes his sour demeanor throughout the years a little less imposing, and it sheds some new light on why he was the way that he was. I just hope he found some peace before the end. But after what I heard, I'm not so sure that it worked out that way. Grandpa passed away a few weeks after my grandmother did, so I suppose he was right when he shared those words with her. I heard from my aunt later that he had been found in his favorite chair, a cup of coffee beside him with a single piece of paper in his lap, etched in a simple handwritten phrase which rattled me to my core. Please don't let it get me. Justin Fotenauer, Swaggity Swoot, Lunas TV, Omni Rubix, Dino, yours truly, Andrew Harrington, Malcolm Black, Mark Norman, Damon McCory, Kathy McGuire, SWAT, Mina Lynn, Takio Zarilla, Sleepy Shroomy, Richard French, Miss Eldridge, Jimmy Griffin, Leon Knott, Sonic GMD, That One Woodsman, Talamagara, Meat Casher, Die Screaming, Nelson Asada, MB Massacre 91,